In the spring of 1887, the town of Harlan Crossing, Nevada had one building no one entered willingly, and one room inside that building that no one entered at all. The mortuary sat at the western edge of the main street, a low adobe structure the color of weathered bone, its shutters the particular gray of wood left too long in the sun. It had belonged to a man named Ostergaard for 14 years before he died of a chest infection in January of that year. Ostergaard had been a quiet, careful man who kept his work separate from the town's living business, who was not unfriendly but was not sought out for conversation, and who left behind a modest estate consisting of a wagon, a gray horse, 2 copper kettles, a stock of pine lumber, a full set of embalming materials, and a building everyone in Harlan Crossing associated with the worst days of their lives. When the county administrator posted the contents for sale, the townspeople who came to bid mostly wanted the wagon and the kettles and the lumber. They did not want the building. They did not want the preparation table, the deep ceramic basin, or the cabinet of glass vials arranged on a shelf above the washstand. Above all, they did not want the back room. A woman named Nora Vane arrived at the auction in the second week of February. She was 27 years old, slight in the way that well-worked people become slight, with the kind of posture that comes from years of bending over small, exacting things. She had traveled from Elko with her tools in a canvas roll strapped to the side of her horse and $31 sewn into the hem of her coat. She was a locksmith. Her father had taught her the trade from the time she could hold a pick, and he was 6 months dead of a wagon accident on the Humboldt Road. And she had no shop because she had no town that would give her one, and she had heard that Harlan Crossing had a problem it did not know how to solve. The back room of the Ostergaard mortuary had been locked from the inside for 11 years. Nora paid $4.70 for the building and everything in it. The auctioneer, a compact man named Pruitt with a mustache he kept trimming at one side, announced the sale to the assembled crowd with a look that said he was granting her a misfortune. A few of the men standing near the wagon laughed. Someone said she had bought herself a good place to work. At least she would have clients who did not argue. The laughter spread a little further. Nora took the deed receipt, folded it twice, and put it in her coat. If any of them thought to wonder why she had paid $4.70 for a locked room in a dead man's mortuary, they did not ask. 11 years. That was the figure that had traveled as far as Elko, carried in the mouths of freight drivers and county surveyors who passed through. The room had been locked in the spring of 1876, in the last weeks of Ostergaard's predecessor, a mortician named Caspar Rude, who had operated the building before the territory even had a proper county administrator. Rude had locked the room himself, or so said the people who had been present on the street that day. And then he had walked to the railroad office and purchased a ticket to Sacramento and had not been seen in Harlan Crossing since. The room remained locked. Ostergaard had worked around it for 14 years, cutting a new doorway in the east wall and using the front 2/3 of the building. He had attempted the lock once, in 1879, with a man brought in from Reno who carried a full bag of tools and charged $5 for the trip. The locksmith had worked the mechanism for 2 hours and declared it beyond his method and departed. After that, Ostergaard left it alone. He left it alone because the lock was not ordinary. Nora had heard this too, through the freight drivers, through a woman in Elko who had cousins in Harlan Crossing. The lock on the back room door was a Griffith's double tumbler mortise with a secondary catch, a mechanism manufactured briefly in Birmingham and imported in small numbers in the 1860s and discontinued by the early 1870s because it was considered too complex to service. Her father had owned one. He had taken it apart on the workbench when she was 11 years old and put it back together and taken it apart again. narrating every step in the flat instructional voice he used when he wanted her to remember. The mechanism had a false gate in the second tumbler that caught most picks and held them. You had to disengage the secondary catch first, from the outside, with a lever of a very specific gauge, before the main tumblers would yield at all. The locksmith from Reno had not known this. Most locksmiths in 1887 did not know it, because the lock had been out of production for 15 years. Her father had known it. Now she knew it. This is the question you press play to have answered, not what was in the room, because you already sense the shape of that, the sense that whatever Casper Ruud locked inside in 1876 has been waiting, patient as rust, for the right hand to open it. The question is what Nora Vane would find when she did, and whether what she found would be enough to undo what Ruud had done before he bought his ticket to Sacramento. She spent the first 3 days clearing the rest of the building. She scrubbed the preparation table with carbolic and salt water, working the solution into the grain of the wood until the water ran clear into the floor drain. She inventoried the vials in the cabinet, holding each to the window light: iron sulfate, alum, powdered white lead, arsenic compounds in brown glass stopped with cork, standard materials for a working mortician of Ostergaard's era. She arranged them by type and cataloged them on a paper she pinned to the wall, intending to contact the county medical administrator about their disposal. She mucked out the small stall behind the building where Ostergaard had kept his horse. She inventoried the tools on the wall hooks, a full set of carpentry implements, a draw knife, 3 chisels, a mallet with a cracked handle she set aside for repair. She found in a tin beneath the workbench $14.30 in coin, which she wrapped in the cloth the tin had held and placed with the deed receipt in her coat. It was Ostergaard's money, which meant it was now hers, and she was not in a position to leave it for someone else to find. She was systematic about it in the way her father had taught her to be systematic about a lock you have not yet opened. Understand the surrounding structure before you touch the mechanism, because what you miss in the surround can bite you later. On the 4th morning, she stood in the passage between the front room and the back. The door was heavy, solid pine over a timber core, hung on iron pintles that had not moved in 11 years. The lock sat in the face of the door at chest height, a rectangular iron plate, the keyhole covered by a small pivoting flap that had rusted half open. The key was visible through the gap. It stood in the keyhole from the inside, turned to the locked position, its bow just catching the light from the single window at the end of the passage. She studied it for a long while without touching it. Her father had taught her that a locked door is a question. The question is not how to open it. The question is why someone chose this particular lock, and why they locked it from this side, and whether they intended someone to follow them in. A Griffith's double tumbler was not a common lock. You did not find one in a Nevada mortuary by accident. Casper Ruud had ordered it specifically, she thought, from someone who knew what it was, and he had locked it from inside and climbed out by some other means. And the key in the lock was not an accident either. The key was a message. She went to her canvas roll and took out the secondary lever, a narrow, flat bar with an angled tip that her father had filed himself from a piece of clock spring and kept in the roll alongside his picks. She had used it twice, once on a locked cash box in Elko that an old man's family could not open after he died, and once on a chest at a ranch house near Battle Mountain, whose owner had forgotten the combination to his own lock and was embarrassed about it. She had never used it on a door. She pressed the lever into the keyhole alongside the standing key, angled the tip, and felt for the secondary catch. It was there, exactly where her father had told her it would be. She had to work it for 20 minutes. The catch had been in its resting position for 11 years, and the mechanism had dried and stiffened. She applied a thin line of oil from the small tin in the roll, worked the lever gently, worked it again. The catch released with a sound like a finger bone popping in cold weather. The main tumblers took another 40 minutes. She worked them in order, gate by gate, her ear close to the plate, feeling through the lever and pick for the slight changes in resistance that told her where each tumbler sat. The false gate in the second tumbler caught her pick 3 times before she found the approach angle her father had shown her. When the last tumbler seated, the bolt slid back inside the lock housing with a sound that was almost quiet. The door swung inward on its own weight. The hinges did not creak. They had been well made. The air that came out was cold, the particular cold of a sealed room in a desert building where summer heat and winter chill have cycled for years without the room breathing. It smelled of paraffin and of something mineral, iron perhaps, and of paper held in dry air for a long time. Nora stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The back room of the Ostergaard Mortuary was not empty. There were 2 things in it: a body locker, the kind used for winter storage, a zinc-lined chest set into the far wall, its lid standing open and empty, and a writing table. The table was covered in papers. She did not touch them yet. She stepped in and stood in the center of the room and looked at what was there. The window on the north wall had been boarded from inside, and the boards had done their work because the papers on the table, though yellowed at the edges, had not faded beyond reading. The lamp on the corner of the table still held paraffin. The chair was pushed back as if Caspar Ruud had stood up from it and walked to the window, and that was the last thing he had done in this room. There was a coffee cup on the table, dried to the porcelain, 11 years of standing still. She took the lamp to the passage, filled it from the supply tin in the cabinet, lit it, carried it back. In the lamp's light, the papers on the table showed themselves for what they were: land records, transfer deeds. 23 of them, she counted, each bearing the seal of the Harlan County Land Office, each signed and dated between April and November of 1874. Beside the deeds, in 2 stacks secured with twine, were what appeared to be the original working copies, the drafts that had been used to produce the official versions filed at the land office. She could see immediately that the original drafts and the filed deeds were not the same. The filed deeds showed sales, willing sellers, named buyers, notarized transactions. The drafts showed something different: 23 properties, mostly small claims on the South Fork of the creek, the kind of alluvial scrape claims that placer miners had staked and then held through the dry years, waiting for water enough to work them. The drafts showed liens, not sales. Liens taken against men and women who had borrowed small amounts from the Harlan County Territorial Bank in the difficult years of 1872 and 1873, and the liens that had been converted, through a process whose paperwork now sat on the table before her, into outright sales without the lien holders ever signing a transfer deed. Their names were on the drafts. 23 names, frontier names, the names of placer miners and sheep farmers, and a widow who had taken a loan to buy seed grain in a bad year. The names of people who believed they still owned their claims because they had never signed them away. She sat down in Caspar Ruud's chair and read for 3 hours. The names on the drafts were specific and various. A woman named Margaret Halverson, widow who had borrowed $8 in the autumn of 1872 against the promise of her South Fork claim as collateral. A man named Tobias Reyes who had borrowed $22 to buy seed corn and a replacement mule after his first mule died in a dry creek crossing. A family named Doss, 2 brothers and a sister who had staked adjacent quarter plots in 1869 and worked them through 5 seasons of indifferent results, who had borrowed $11 collectively, and whose 3 names appeared on a single lien instrument, converted by the same mechanism into a deed transfer that bore none of their signatures. Most of the 23 line instruments had been executed in a 3-week window in March of 1874, all notarized by the same hand, all filed with the land office within 4 days of each other. It was the sort of efficiency that only becomes possible when the same person controls the notary stamp, the filing desk, and the bank account. The deeds in the filed version at the land office would show willing sellers who had received fair consideration. The drafts on the table showed the consideration: $9 here, $12 there, amounts so small against the value of the claims that they read not as prices but as administrative fees, the cost of the paperwork that extinguished a person's ownership of their own ground. If you have ever wondered what a quiet theft looks like, it looks like this: a column of figures on a bank ledger, a notary's stamp applied to a document the signer never read, a land office recorder who does not ask why a transfer deed lacks a witness from the selling party. It looks like a stack of papers on a table, patient and orderly, waiting for someone to read them. Caspar Rood, it appeared, had been the man who set the stamps and made the filings. But there was a second name on every document, the name of the bank official who had authorized the lien conversions and signed the receiving party's line on every fraudulent deed. His name was Elias Peck. He had served as the branch manager of the Harlan County Territorial Bank from 1871 to 1878, and Nora knew from what she had heard in Elko that he was now the treasurer of the county itself. There was a third document on the table, separate from the stacks, weighed down by the dried coffee cup, as though Rood had placed it there deliberately. It was a letter, written in a cramped but legible hand on bank stationery, dated March 9th, 1876. It was signed by Elias Peck. It instructed Caspar Rood that his participation in the land transaction process was no longer required, and that his continued residency in Harlan County would not be compatible with the bank's interests. It was, read plainly, a letter telling a man to leave or face consequences. Rood had taken the letter, gathered every draft and every copy in his possession, locked them in the one room in his building that no one could open, without specific knowledge, locked himself inside long enough to leave the key in the lock from inside, and then climbed out through the boarded window. The window board was hinged on one side. She checked it now, pressing the edge. It swung outward on a simple hook and eye, well oiled. He had thought of everything. He had left the evidence where it could not be destroyed by anyone who did not know the lock, and he had left the key turned in the hole as a signal, clear only to someone who would understand what a key left in a lock from the inside meant. It meant the person who locked this room expected someone to follow them. Her father would have understood it immediately. She suspected that was not a coincidence. She spent 2 more days in the room, reading every document twice, making a clean copy of each in her own hand, recording names and dates and dollar amounts in the order they appeared. The 23 claims amounted at 1874 land values to approximately $4,200 of property. At 1887 values, given that water had come to the South Fork in 1881 and the alluvial claims were now workable, the figure was considerably larger. She did not try to calculate it precisely. It was not her number to calculate. The third document she found separately, beneath the coffee cup. Peck's letter. She read it 3 times. Its language was careful and cold, in the way of a man who knew that letters could be used as evidence, and who had nonetheless put the threat in writing because he was confident the recipient would not survive to produce it. Caspar Rood had survived. He had simply done the next best thing. She took the letter to the window and looked at the signature. Elias Peck, county treasurer, as of 1887. The man who had sent a letter telling a mortician to leave town was now administering the county's public funds. She set the letter back beneath the coffee cup exactly where she had found it, because she did not want it mixed with the rest until she had decided how it fit. On the morning of the 6th day, she left the mortuary and walked to the rooming house on the east side of the main street, where she had been told she could find a man named Ike Prout, who had been working the South Fork claims since water came, and who had been trying, without success, since 1882 to trace the title history of the ground he worked. The woman at the rooming house, a Mrs. Teal who ran the establishment with her nephew, told Nora that Prout took his breakfast on the side porch and that he would be there until 9, and that she should not knock, but simply come around the building. Nora came around the building. Prout was sitting in a straight chair with a coffee cup in his hands, looking at the mountains south of town, and he turned when he heard her boots on the boards and didn't look surprised to see her, which Nora thought was either a good sign or a sign that the news of her purchase had been well distributed through town. She told him what she had found, standing on the porch, because he had not invited her to sit, and she had not asked. She spoke in the ordered way she had planned, the lien instruments first, then the conversion mechanism, then the filed deeds and their discrepancy with the drafts, then the names. She did not tell him his father's name was on the list until she had laid out the full shape of the fraud, because she wanted him to understand the mechanism before the personal weight of it landed. It took 25 minutes. When she finished, he sat in his chair by the window and did not speak for a long time. "My father was on that list," he said finally. "He died in 1880 thinking he'd lost the claim in a bad debt." "He didn't lose it in a bad debt," Nora said. "He was named on a lien against $14. The deed transfer was filed without his signature. The draft is in the room." Prout was quiet again. Then he said, "You'll need someone from the Territorial Land Commission, not the county. The county has Peck." "I know," Nora said. "I will need a witness to the documents before I move them. Will you come?" He came the following morning. He brought with him a woman named Ruth Carver, who had filed a complaint at the county office in 1883 about her mother's claim and been told the records showed a willing sale and there was nothing to review. Ruth Carver was 44 years old and had the quality of a person who has been told no so many times that she had simply filed the word away somewhere and kept going without it. She was a stout woman with gray coming into her hair and the careful economy of movement of someone who doesn't waste effort on gestures that will not produce results. She had walked 2 miles from the south side of town in the early morning, and she was not out of breath. She stood at the door of the back room for a moment before entering. Nora had the lamp lit and the documents laid out on the table in the order she had organized them. The room was cold, as it always was in the morning, and the window glass she had not yet replaced let a gray February light in at an angle that made the papers look very old. Ruth Carver walked to the table and looked at the papers for a long time without touching them. Then she picked up the one bearing her mother's name, a woman listed in the draft as Elise Carver, one claim on the South Fork, lien value $9, and held it at an angle to the lamp. "That is not her signature," Ruth Carver said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "My mother could not write. She signed everything with a mark. She was proud of it, a good clean X. She practiced it on the back of letters. That is a written name." "I know," Nora said. "Who wrote it?" "The same hand that signed as notary on 6 of the other instruments," Nora said. "I have compared them. The letter forms are consistent." Ruth Carver set the document back on the table, carefully in its place. She stood for another moment looking at it. "She filed her complaint with the county in 1878, she said. "She was told the deed was valid. She died in 1882 thinking she had lost the ground." "The deed was not valid," Nora said. "The draft proves it. The commission will have to agree." She had already noted the signature discrepancy in her copy. She wrote to the Territorial Land Commission office in Carson City the same afternoon, sitting at the writing table in the back room with the wide lamp lit and the February's cold coming in at the gaps in the boarded window. She used the formal language she had learned from reading legal notices in the Elko paper for years, and from the way her father had written to county clerks when a job required their cooperation. She cited the document types, the date ranges, the 23 names, and the nature of the discrepancy between the filed deeds and the original drafts. She was careful not to make accusations by name in the letter, listing only the official positions involved in the transaction chain. She enclosed copies of 3 of the most legible draft documents, folded inside a clean piece of wrapper paper, and sealed the envelope with wax she found in the desk drawer. She asked for a commission agent to come and examine the originals. An agent named Farwell arrived 17 days later on the morning stage. He was a lean, methodical man of about 50, who wore the same expression reviewing documents as he did ordering his dinner, a quality of precise and slightly distant attention, as though he were reading something important and would tell you what it said when he was finished. He brought his own lamp and his own magnifying glass and a leather dispatch case that he set on the floor beside the writing table. Without opening it for the first hour, he spent a day and a half in the back room of the mortuary without once asking Nora how she had obtained entry to it. He was not interested in the lock. He was interested in the documents. He took careful notes in a leather-bound ledger and asked Nora twice to confirm the provenance of the drafts, meaning whether they had been in the room when she opened it and had not been brought in from elsewhere. She confirmed it both times. He asked to speak with Ruth Carver and with Ike Prout, and he spoke with them each for 40 minutes. On the morning he departed, he told Nora, plainly and without ceremony, that the commission would open a formal review of the 23 transfers. He said it would take time, that these things always took time, that land title reviews were careful processes and not fast ones. He told her the original documents should remain in the building until a commission representative returned for them, and he asked if she was willing to serve as their custodian. She said she was. Elias Peck was in his office at the county courthouse when the first formal inquiry letter arrived from Carson City, 6 weeks after Farwell's visit. He read it and did not respond for 8 days, and then he submitted a letter through a lawyer in Reno disputing the authenticity of the draft documents. The commission sent a documents examiner from San Francisco the following spring, who spent 4 days examining paper composition, ink age, and typeset characteristics. The examiner's report noted that the drafts were consistent with the materials and methods of the early 1870s and showed no evidence of recent manufacture. Nora was not present when the formal findings were delivered. She was in the back room on a Tuesday morning, taking stock of the documents for the 3rd time before the commission representatives arrived to collect them, when she heard the stage come in, and then the sound of the commission wagon on the main street. She rolled the documents into their protective sleeves and tied each bundle with fresh twine, the way her father had shown her to store things that would need to survive transit. Ruth Carver came to the mortuary that afternoon with her daughter. The daughter was 9 years old and stood in the doorway of the back room with her eyes very wide, looking at the writing table and the lamp and the boarded window and the zinc-lined chest standing open. She asked her mother what had been in the room for so long. Ruth Carver looked at the table for a moment before she answered. "The truth," she said. "It just needed someone who knew the right door." The Land Commission review consumed 19 months. At its conclusion, 12 of the 23 transfers were formally invalidated. The claims returned to the descendants of the original holders, or where no descendant could be located, held in a territorial trust. 5 additional transfers were invalidated through a secondary review process that the original findings had prompted. Elias Peck resigned his position as county treasurer in the second month of the review, before the findings were complete, and left Harlan Crossing for a destination the county administrator's office recorded only as east. The township never brought a criminal proceeding. The law in 1889 wasn't designed to make it easy, but the claims were returned and the record was corrected, and the names that had been erased from the land office ledger were written back in. Ike Prout filed a working claim on the South Fork plot his father had held, in his father's name as primary and his own as successor. In November of 1889, he had it working by spring. Casper Rood's letter remained in the back room after the commission took the rest. It was not part of the formal evidence package. Nora read it one more time on the morning the commission wagon came for the last time, then folded it and put it in the tin she kept her spare clock springs in, the tin she had inherited from her father along with the secondary lever and the picks, and the flat, careful understanding of why doors are locked and what it means when the key stays in the hole. She did not leave Harlan Crossing. She opened her locksmith shop in the front room of the mortuary, where the preparation table had been, and she was there for many years. The back room she kept as a workroom. She had a second lamp made, a wide-base kerosene lamp, and she set it on the writing table where Casper Rood's coffee cup had stood, and she left the door open. There is something to be said for a room that waited 11 years for the right hand. There is something to be said for the patience of locked things, the way they hold what they were given and give it only to someone who understands what it costs to open them. Her father had said something like this once, not in those words, but in the way he had turned a Griffith's double tumbler over in his hands the first time he showed her the false gate in the second tumbler. He had said, "The thing about a good lock is that it doesn't care who you are. It cares only whether you know the answer." She had known the answer. What would you have done if you had arrived at that door in 1887 and understood what the key in the lock meant? If this story settles something you have carried, leave it in the comments. And if you want another story of a woman who reads what others cannot, one more is waiting for you when this one ends. The town of Harlan Crossing, Nevada. The spring of 1887. One building, one room, one door, and the woman who knew the answer to the lock. The locksmith shop drew its first customer in the third week after Nora opened it. A sheep rancher named Corbett from 10 miles south who had a padlock on his winter grain shed. He could not open because the key had snapped off in the mechanism the previous autumn, and he had spent the winter chopping through a plank board each time he needed grain and repairing the plank with nails. He stood in the doorway of the shop with his hat in his hands and the broken key shank in his shirt pocket, and looked at the woman behind the counter as though he was not entirely sure she was real. She asked him to describe the padlock. He described it. She named the manufacturer without asking again and told him it would take 20 minutes and cost 50 cents. He paid without argument. She had it open in 14. He came back the following month with 2 neighbors. The town adjusted to her in the way that small towns adjust to things they did not choose and cannot undo, which is to say they circled for a time at a careful distance, and then gradually, almost accidentally, began to find reasons to come to her. A hardware merchant named Selby sent his son to have a chest rekeyed. The county administrator's wife came one afternoon with a jewelry box whose lock had jammed, and Nora opened it in her presence in 4 minutes, and the woman went back to her house and told her husband, and her husband sent Nora a formal letter asking whether she would be willing to serve as the county's designated locksmith for the courthouse locks. She accepted by return note. Pruitt, the auctioneer who had sold her the building, came in December of that first year. He stood at the counter with his hat in his hand and asked whether she would take a look at his office door lock, which had been sticking since September. She came to his office the next morning and examined the mechanism and told him the cylinder was worn and needed replacement, not repair, and told him the cost. He agreed and she did the work, and when she left, he said, looking at the ceiling rather than at her, that he had thought the building was worth nothing, and he had been wrong about that. She said she knew. He nodded once and paid. There were things she still did not know, and she was honest with herself about that. She did not know where Caspar Ruud had gone after Sacramento, whether he had found another trade in another territory, or whether he had died somewhere unremarked, carrying the knowledge of what he had done and what he had left behind. The commission records did not mention him. The letter she kept in the tin named him only as a party to the transactions, not as their architect. She thought he had been at some point complicit, that the clean copies and the arranged drafts and the notary stamps had not been applied without his participation. She also thought something had changed in him at some point in that final spring of 1876, and the change had produced the boarded window and the oiled hinge, and the Griffiths' double tumbler, and the key left turned in the hole. She did not forgive this calculus exactly. She did not condemn it exactly either. She held it the way she held a mechanism she was still reading, attentive and uncommitted, waiting for the parts to show her what they were. What she knew with certainty was the thing that mattered. The documents had waited, and she had opened the room, and the names had been written back into the record. On the last Sunday of November in 1887, Ike Prout came to the mortuary with a dish of roasted venison wrapped in cloth that his daughter had sent. He set it on the workroom table and looked at the open door and the lamp on the writing table. "She wanted you to have it," he said. "Ruth Carver's daughter, too," she said to say. "She is learning to read. Her teacher says she is fast." Nora thanked him. She kept the dish on the writing table through the afternoon, and when the November dark came down, she lit the wide lamp and ate at the table where Caspar Ruud had sat for the last time in the spring of 1876, and the light was warm on the walls of the room, and the window was no longer boarded. She had replaced the boards with glass in October. The room needed light, and she was the one to give it. The Griffiths' double tumbler lock remained on the door. She had serviced it, oiled the catch and the tumblers and the bolt housing, and it moved now with the smooth certainty of a thing properly maintained. She left it in the door because it was a good lock, one of the best she had ever worked, and because her father had taught her that you do not remove a good lock simply because someone once used it badly. You clean it, and you set it right, and you leave it where it belongs. The key she kept in the lock, on the inside, turned back to the open position now, but there in the hole where Ruud had left it, where it had waited 11 years. Some mornings she turned it as she came in, just for the satisfying click of the tumbler's seating, and turned it back, and hung her coat and sat down at the table with whatever mechanism had come in for repair. Her father's secondary lever hung on a hook above the table, on a nail she had driven into the plaster with the heel of her palm. It was the first thing she looked at in the morning, and the last thing she looked at in the evening. This narrow, flat bar of filed clock spring, with the angled tip, this particular answer to a particular question. You could not carry the whole of a person you had lost. She understood that. But you could carry the specific thing they had given you, the skill that fit no other hand quite the same way, the knowledge that lived in your fingers and your listening, and the particular way you held a pick when the second tumbler was fighting you. She carried all of that. She worked it every day. And once, in the spring of 1876, that carrying had been enough to open a door that had waited 11 years for someone who knew it was a question. The South Fork claims, when the water ran well in the years that followed, produced modest amounts, nothing that made anyone wealthy. Ike Prout worked his father's plot through the 1890s with his two sons, and when his sons were grown, they worked it still. And the deed in the land office in Carson City bore the name it should have borne since 1874. Ruth Carver's mother had died without knowing her name had been restored to the record. Ruth Carver knew. She made a point of knowing. The town of Harlan Crossing, Nevada, changed in the way that small towns change when they are not looking. A new building here, a new family there, a second well dug in the east side. The mortuary building changed too over the years. Nora had a sign painted, small and plain, above the front door. It gave her name and her trade. The sign was the color of the red shawl she wore through the cold months, vivid against the bleached adobe, visible from halfway down the main street. She was there for many years. The back room in all that time remained unlocked.